Welcome to the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I am your host, Ryan Mckern. Join us weekly for haunted history podcasts, stories, ghosts, historical New Orleans, and beyond. Join me tonight as we listen to the tales of St. Roch Cemetery, one of my favorite cemeteries in the city, and one of the most haunted in the country. Sit back and dwell in the darkness, my friend, and welcome to the Wicked Webs We Weave. St. Roch Cemetery is one of the least visited cemeteries in New Orleans. Maybe this is why the ghosts of New Orleans feel so comfortable hanging out in the historic cemetery. For almost 100 years, there have been ghost stories coming out of St. Roch Cemetery. And while our New Orleans ghosts perhaps roam within its walls, we must tell you about this. I personally enjoy this cemetery for everything it is. It's in a community and in a location that I love so much, and this always brings me a smile when I visit this place. I don't get to visit as often as I would like to, so doing this podcast is somewhat therapeutic, and living through projectional means, perhaps we can all get into the vibe of this cemetery this evening. The history of St. Roch Cemetery was founded by Reverend P.I. Thavis in 1874 during one of New Orleans' yellow fever outbreaks. Patron of Saint Protection from epidemics, St. Roch was prayed to and was asked to protect the people of New Orleans during this epidemic. When nobody from the Reverend's church died of yellow fever, Theovis founded the cemetery as part of the promise to St. Roch. Promised that if St. Roch would keep those people safe, he would build a chapel to St. Roch. This chapel is now inside of St. Roch Cemetery. Today, St. Roch Cemetery is one of the least visited large cemeteries in New Orleans. I beg to differ, as his texts say. However, I think that with the healing center nearby and everything building up in the neighborhood, I think it's more visited now than ever. Any given day, you can go there and find yourself. Maybe this is why there are a number of ghost stories associated with St. Roch Cemetery. Ghosts seem to prefer to be left alone, and St. Roch Cemetery is a great place to go and be by yourself. Walk with me and meet the spirits of St. Roch Cemetery. The first spirit we meet this evening is man's best friend. Even when he passes, he is still right by our side. The history of the St. Roch Cemetery dog. Perhaps the most famous ghost story associated with St. Roch Cemetery is that of a ghost dog, which is often seen wandering through the cemetery. The ghost dog of St. Roch Cemetery is described as an unnaturally large black dog. It's been captured in pictures and video, supposedly on tours. Now, is it possible that this ghost is simply a stray dog wandering the cemetery? Valid question. But the evidence and the stories of the locals suggest and prove that this apparition of the ghost dog finds itself wandering the cemetery, astray in the afterlife, perhaps. When people try to walk up and catch the dog or get a better picture, it vanishes with no way of escaping, often vanishing into corners and walls. Interestingly enough, the saint which the cemetery is named after, Saint Roch, was the patron saint of dogs. Could this explain why the ghost of a dog is seen in the cemetery? Our next ghost is the hooded ghost of Saint Roch. This ghost is a hooded figure that can be seen walking through the cemetery. Now, just a hooded figure walking through the cemetery would be strange on its own, but it doesn't make it a ghost. So why do people think that the hooded figure is a ghost? Maybe the fact that it has been seen walking through the walls which surround Saint Roch Cemetery. Imagine being a visitor in Saint Roch Cemetery. You're just walking around minding your own business, checking out the tombs and burial vaults which fill Saint Roch Cemetery. And all of a sudden you see a man dressed in a black robe, his hood pulled over the covering his head. Surely you'd pay attention. It isn't a sight you see every day. Then just as quickly you notice him, he walks through a wall, or simply vanishes into nothing. If that wouldn't send a chill up your spine, I don't know what would. The hooded ghost has even been seen walking through the cemetery after the gates are locked. Nobody can get in or out. And for some reason, the ghost still wanders the pathways of the cemetery. Nobody knows whose ghost this is. We can assume, based on his clothing, that he is involved with the church, but we cannot say for sure. If you're ever in Saint Roch Cemetery and see a man in a black robe wandering around, follow him. You may be one of the lucky few people to see the hooded ghost of the Saint Roch Cemetery. Many visitors and locals alike state they see apparitions of all shapes and sizes passing through the cemetery gates. It is no wonder why this is a hotspot of paranormal activity, being located in one of the oldest neighborhoods in the country. The Saint Roch Cemetery is also close by to many businesses, many haunted establishments in its own right. But it's also one of the lesser visited cemeteries. Saint Roch Cemetery is one of the most unique cities of the dead in New Orleans. This is a big statement in a city of 43 separate above-ground cemeteries. So what makes it so unique? In its center is a small chapel lined with dismembered fake dolls and body parts. While this may seem like the site of some satanic ritual or example of an artistic integrity of the Crescent City, it serves as a signal of hope for an old city plagued by pestilence. The Saint Roch Cemetery was established in 1874 by Reverend Peter Leonard Thievis for the diminishing German congregation of the nearby Holy Trinity Church. Yellow fever was rampant throughout the city, and the disease spared no man, woman, or child, regardless of race, religion, or creed. Originally named Campo Santo after the cemetery, church, and hospice, the German located on the south side of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, St. Roch's Chapel was dedicated on August 16, 1876, on St. Roch's feast. The cemetery was built in honor of the patron saint of dogs, bachelors, invalids, and most importantly, of wandering off disease. Through the epidemic of 1868, Reverend Thievis turned into a familiar face for healing and hope. St. Roch is often prayed by the members of Thievis' congregation during the times of pestilence, promised his followers that if the disease spared them, he would construct a chapel in honor of the lesser-known saints in the center of a great cemetery. While being one of the 3 major outbreaks of yellow fever in the post-Civil War era, the 1868 outbreak still took hundreds of lives in the life of James Garlier Jr., the New Orleans architect. Still, it appears the congregation of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church survived in full. A St. Roch's chapel and the cemetery were officially designated in 1874. Soon many curious neighborhood residents began seeing doll parts lining the inner walls of the sanctum. It was common practice to leave St. Roch offerings that resembled body parts healed by his grace. To this day, many of those doll limbs and plaster body parts remain in the chapel. Often described as a pilgrim paired with a canine companion and seashell in hand, St. Roch was born in Montpellier, France, in 1295. He was the only son of a wealthy governor from the city, born with a deep red cross on his chest. He had a pious upbringing, and his mother believed him to possess great healing powers. At the age of 20, his parents had passed, and his began life as a traveling monk, joining the Third Order Franciscans. He eventually found himself in Acquapotente, Italy. The plague had ravaged the town, and they turned into the wanderer for assistance. Sensing his holy powers, St. Roch would create the sign of the cross over the townspeople, and miraculously the ailments would disappear. Soon he contracted the disease and wandered off to die in solace. A small dog found him and gently tended to his wounds, licking his open sores and bringing him food. He was miraculously healed. While his story ends in misery, returning to his city only to be labeled a spy and thrown in jail till his death, he brought relief to those around him. People still visit his shrine. Mass is held on the first Friday of each month at 10 a.m. Reverend Thivus is buried beneath the marble floor of the St. Roch Chapel. Despite it holy reverence to the congregation, odd happenings have still taken place inside the St. Roch Cemetery. In 1937, reports of a lone woman rising out of her tomb and sitting atop a grave came flooding into the New Orleans Tribune. People gathered every night for weeks hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom woman, especially with the prints in her tomb. While the Tribune attributed this to just being the shadow of an urn, coupled with 2 trees in the distance, many still report seeing the woman on a nightly basis, a mere block away from the cemetery walls. One nearby resident reports seeing a ghastly apparition through his window on many shadowy nights. As with many New Orleans homes, their house was raised a couple of feet in case of flooding. The resident and local trombonist, known locally as Outlaw Dave, reported seeing a figure of a man appearing clearly the waist up outside his window, a good 8 feet above the ground. His wife, an educator, a dancer in the community, Miss Christine, reports being awoken late at night by raps on their window from the same curious spirit. Perhaps a lost soul searching their tomb, long forgotten, or former resident of the home. They have since moved and declared the spirit was harmless, yet quite rude and pestersome. Aside from the chapel and the many spirits that roam the cemetery, visitors can find the luxurious and beautiful above-ground tombs, chapel, and the grounds are peaceful to walk through. Located walking distance to the healing center and the St. Roch market full of vendors. This is truly a beautiful place in the middle of a neighborhood whose richest history runs very deep. Thank you for joining me once again in the shadows, my friend, for the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I'd like to thank usghostadventures.com, ghostcitytours.com, and the St. Roch Cemetery in St. Roch neighborhood for research and making this episode. Sit back and dwell in the darkness, my friends, and until we meet again, au revoir.